Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, in this episode, I'm exploring something that is really at the heart of fantasy, science fiction, horror, and what is called magical realism. The idea that imagination is not merely an escape from reality. Well, at least not all the time. There's a little bit more depth to it than that. Instead, it's one of the deepest ways we can understand reality to employ the imagination and, sometimes bend the rules of reality with our minds, man. So, at first glance, fantasy seems like the opposite of the real world. Dragons, spaceships, magic, parallel universes, they're things we know don't exist, at least not in our everyday lives. But that's exactly the point. Fantastica, the broad family of fantasy, science fiction, horror, and magical realism, doesn't entirely reject reality, it just stretches it. It asks what reality might become if we loosened some of its rules. And in many ways, it works just like dreaming. Think about what happens when you dream, in those moments where you can actually remember a dream after it's over. The ordinary world doesn't disappear, at least not entirely. Instead, your mind performs a kind of alchemy, transforming the leaden weight of everyday life into something extraordinary. So, familiar people become strangers, impossible landscapes suddenly feel perfectly natural, time can bend, identity can shift, the impossible becomes believable. Well, at least in a lot of dreams. Yeah, I guess sometimes, dreams just freak us out, and those are what we normally call nightmares. So, those types of dreams, they might not entirely be believable, and we might freak out because we can't believe what is happening. But nevertheless, the impossible becomes apparently maybe possible. Dreams don't simply ignore reality, they sort of remix it. So Fantastica performs that same transformation. It takes the familiar building blocks of our world, like physics, psychology, history, politics, and morality, and subjects them to imaginative pressure, revealing possibilities we might otherwise never consider. A spaceship is not simply a faster airplane, it's like a thought experiment. Once humanity leaves Earth behind, what parts of human nature remain? How do isolation, distance, exploration, or first contact with alien civilizations redefine who we are? And also, let's remember that at a certain point in, well, for most of human history, the idea of space travel was just that, an idea. And then what do you know? Suddenly, the science caught up with the imagination, and people applied the right nuts and bolts and all that, and they built these spacecrafts that were capable of actually launching people into outer space. And, that was a triumph of the imagination, and of course, popular will as well as individual will. So it was all these different things coming together, but it all had its roots in imagination and ideas that were at one point considered fantastical. And of course, you could say that about a lot of innovations like flying, motorized vehicles in general. Of course, the internet would also qualify, so would the use of telephones. Just so many things that people can take for granted today really had their roots in people's imaginations. And what once seemed like sheer sci fi is now just something that we do every day. And once that's how things are, I think it becomes normalized to sort of expand the imagination, or at least it should be normalized, I would say. And science fiction uses technology not because technology is the point, but because it becomes a tool for asking questions about humanity itself. And fantasy works in much the same way. A dragon is not merely an oversized reptile with wings that shoots fire out of its mouth. it's sort of the embodiment of our oldest fears, maybe, all sorts of primitive fears of these monsters, and a challenge that every hero must confront before becoming something greater. It's a variation on an old theme of just facing some unknown or just unique fear. And the creature is symbolic as much as it is physical. The impossible gives shape to emotions that are otherwise difficult to describe. This is where Fantastica begins to resemble dreams even more closely. Both dissolve the rigid categories that organize everyday experience. In dreams, we accept contradictions, often without much hesitation. We can be children and adults simultaneously. Time can run backwards. A familiar home can suddenly become like a foreign country. Several versions of ourselves can exist at once. And while we are dreaming, quite often, very little or maybe even none of this seems strange. We can be at home in the unknown, and Fantastica invites us into worlds governed by similarly different rules. Magic becomes a legitimate force, technology reshapes civilization beyond recognition, and the supernatural walks openly among ordinary people. In magical realism, especially, the extraordinary quietly coexists with the mundane. Miracles occur without fanfare, reminding us that reality may be richer and stranger than strict rationalism allows. And these stories, they're not just escapist entertainment, although they can be at times, I suppose, but they can also be exercises in expanding consciousness. And by imagining worlds that apparently don't exist, we enlarge our understanding of the one that does. And that is interesting. It's again what inspires people to think differently. So that's why, despite being kind of a rationalist at heart, I also engage in silly meanderings mentally. I imagine a bunch of crazy stuff happening because I think having a wild and active imagination, that doesn't necessarily contradict having a core sense of reality and valuing a sort of philosophy that really understands reality. You can understand reality and even recognize limits while at the same time imagining what life would be like if we could overcome those limits. Because if you understand what limits exist, you can better surpass them in some circumstances. And that brings us to a famous observation by filmmaker Orson Welles. The enemy of art is the absence of limitations. So at first, that sounds completely backwards. Wouldn't artists wouldn't artists produce better work if they had unlimited freedom? Well, not necessarily, because limitations can force creativity. A poet works within the constraints of language, at least uh, typically. I suppose there might be some poets who, in some ways, defy conventional language use, and you might say they're actually playing outside of those rules entirely. But for the most part, you still have language constraints that are familiar in works of poetry, and that actually can make poetry better. Similarly, a composer works within rhythm and harmony, or at least within the realm of sound. I mean, what would the composition of a song be without ears to hear it and without sounds to be heard? That would just be entirely abstract, I suppose. And a filmmaker works within budgets, technology, and time, so they often have to find creative ways around real life difficulties, and sometimes that creates innovations that they probably would not have made if they had everything they had wanted at first. So even fantasy, which seems limitless, depends on rules. Well, for some people anyway. So magic systems often require consistency. Science fiction typically demands believable internal logic. Horror relies on carefully controlled suspense, at least if it's done well. So without boundaries, stories often become these arbitrary things, and they usually do not become classics. Without structure, imagination often will lose its power. Ironically, limits often inspire greater creativity than unlimited freedom ever could. That doesn't mean artists should not be free. On the contrary, artistic freedom is basically essential. History is full of masterpieces that were once dismissed as offensive, shocking, or dangerous. Works like Guernica challenged political violence. Michelangelo's The Last Judgment provoked controversy for its depiction of the human body. Many celebrated novels, films, and songs were criticized long before they were recognized as cultural landmarks. So creativity thrives when artists are free to experiment, challenge conventions, and express some difficult truths, and sometimes just attempt to outright debunk things. But freedom isn't the same thing as immunity from criticism. Artists are free to create controversial work. Audiences are equally free to reject it. Critics may condemn it. Publishers may refuse to print it. Museums may decline to exhibit it. Freedom of expression has always existed alongside freedom of response. Neither cancels the other, and perhaps that's another kind of limitation one every artist eventually encounters. Art enters into conversation with society. So sometimes that conversation becomes praise, sometimes it's outrage, sometimes it's misunderstanding. But the conversation itself is part of what gives art its meaning. And I have to say, this is maybe a little bit of an aside here, but not every critic of a plot hole simply lacks imagination. Sometimes a plot hole can just be lousy writing. You know, uh, it's debatable, of course. They say that everything is subjective, and it sure seems like that. But nevertheless, sometimes you can just criticize something that seems a little too far out there, and your criticism might actually be valid, um, in terms of just saying that doesn't match the overall tone or the overall rules that were created in this work of fiction, and it doesn't necessarily mean the critic is somebody who's just lacking in fun or imagination or the ability to understand. I think sometimes fantasy can get a little bit too silly, even for me, and I have to put it aside and do something else. So still, in the end, dreams, fantasy, and great art, they all ask us to imagine possibilities beyond the ordinary. And, that's one of the reasons I still engage in this sort of stuff. They remind us that reality is not a prison, at least not always, but it can be like a starting point. The impossible isn't valuable because it lets us escape the world, it's valuable because it helps us see the world differently. Although sometimes escape is necessary just to retain sanity, because if you're doing nothing but looking at reality all the time, the cold hard truth with all the facts, well, sometimes you can overdose on reality. Sometimes it can be too much. It can be too overwhelming. And I think you sometimes need to look at things not as they necessarily are, but as they could be, in order to bring back a little bit of sanity to your own thinking and your own mind. And maybe that's why Fantastica continues to last. Every dragon, every haunted house, and magic spell, and impossible voyage through space is ultimately another way of asking the oldest question of all: what else might be possible? What else might be out there? And if it's a truly inspiring thing, well, maybe you can make the impossible possible. Well, that's it. I've said enough on this topic, this broad range of topics, really, this cluster of topics. So thanks for listening, and until next time, keep imagining and keep questioning the boundaries of the worlds that you think you know, because you might not know the world that surrounds you.